Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second of the SADAA ReUnited Roundtables, which is an effort by the South Asian Diaspora Arts Archive to map changes across the 1960s and 70s when politics and protest put race on the map, through to the 1980s and 90s when funding started coming through and artists, writers, and performers from that first generation South Asian diaspora started creating work, started building companies, and getting themselves on the map. In our first roundtable, we looked at funding and policy and how money through the Arts Council and the Arts That Britain Ignores, through Section 11 funding, through local councils, from the GLC and from Channel 4, started creating national conversations and platforms for those artists to start showcasing their work. In this, the second roundtable, we're talking to the writers and performers who were creating bottom-up change, who were taking their futures in their own hands, and in doing so, were actually opening doors to new artists from their own communities. With me tonight are Rukhsana Ahmad, Shobana Jeyasingh Jatinder Verma, Sudha Bhuchar, Romesh Gunesekara, and Piali. All of them are movers and shakers who really did make a change. Tonight, they're going to tell us about their own stories. We're not trying to create a timeline. We're just trying to capture a series of observations and stories that give you a starting point for looking at that time in our evolution, in our cultural and arts evolution. I'm going to ask everybody to speak for 5 minutes because we are determined to make this roundtable, which is partnered with Birmingham Museums Trust and funded by the National Heritage Lottery Fund, a really important resource that will be available on the SADAA archive. I'm going to ask everybody to talk for 5 minutes, just taking us back to the 1980s, telling us what was happening in their lives and what they started to do to create the change for which they are known today, starting with Jetinda Verma.
Thank you, Shobana. And kind of reminds me of the early days. One of the early days, there's a feedback that is caused by me.
It's one of those nights, isn't it?
Exactly. That's exactly what it was reminding me of. One of the things that we used to rail against in the 70s was that every so often you'd get these sort of Asian events, and they were renowned for being technically rubbish. There would always be some microphone problem, speaker problem, whatever else. So I'm delighted to be taken back to the 70s. Just to pick up on what Shava has said, and just briefly talk about what led me to do what I did or am doing, is a death, really. And this was the killing of this young sick boy in Southall. Now, to give you a context, 1976 is the hottest summer on record. It's also the summer of extreme racism as far as Asians are concerned. Foreign students are killed at London University, then at Aldwych. Famously, a family of migrants, which arrives at Heathrow, is picked up by the local councillor of Slough and dumped at the footsteps of the Foreign Office. They didn't want anything to do with this particular family. And it kind of culminates on July the 4th, 1976, at 7 o'clock in the evening, in the killing of this young boy, Gurdeep Singh Chaggar. I say young, he was 17. And what's important about that is that it led to 4 days of what are now termed riots, but it was a kind of no-go area. It's the first time that Southall, which was already renowned as a kind of Indian area, Southall became a no-go area for whites. Young people came out onto the streets and they would brick cars going by. And it's the first time in recorded history that Asians became a kind of, what do you call it, a public problem. They achieved a public presence. And it opened up, there were these inevitable things about two cultures, that the kind of generational divide, all of that stuff. But very importantly, it created a whole stream of activists who then, many of whom are still very active in civil liberties. People like Suresh Grover, for example, who is one of the key people involved in a number of the civil liberties campaign. So it really ushered a whole generation of people who had one cry, which was, why? Why? And it spawned all sorts of youth movements. I think there was a Birmingham youth movement. There was certainly a Bradford one, a Bristol youth movement. All of these youth movements started. And as part of that movement, really, was the company that we formed. And I suppose part of that sort of question of why, for us, was also this thing, an absolute recognition that we are a new culture. We're neither Indian, or wherever else we came from, nor are we British. Racism is not our problem, but then what are we? What are we? And to look at the forms, and eventually we chose theatre, as a way of expressing or articulating what are we? What is it? What does it mean to be Asian? I don't think that project has in any way completed, and I'm delighted to see that the project kind of, in a way, continues, and it continues in some extraordinary fashions. And some of the extraordinary is represented here, you know, in dance, in theatre, in writing, in painting, in music. And so that was the thing, this absolute recognition of an articulation or attempt to articulate what is the new, what does it mean to be Asian? An invented term, a term that has no meaning outside of Britain, and in fact was invented in East Africa as a way of not saying Indian or Pakistani or Hindu or Muslim or whatever. So the colonial administrators said Asian. And so it arrived, this is my only bit of boasting, it arrived with me. I arrived here on February the 14th, 1968, and I was a headline, Asian Exodus from Kenya. And that's really where this term Asian begins to come. And I think that we have begun to kind of own it now. And that's been the kind of the journey. And as a kind of final thing, there was a wonderful line that Hanif Qureshi wrote, which comes out in the film My Beautiful Laundrette. And there's this character played by Saeed Jaffrey, and he's sort of chucking out these young men from his rented accommodation. And at one point he shouts out, listen, boys, I'm a professional landlord, not a professional packy. Oh, this is a brilliant line. This line is about not being victim. It's about saying, this is what I am. I'm a landlord. Treat me like that. You hate me as a landlord, nothing else.
Well, Jetinda, what you didn't do was name Tara Arts, which is the crucible, I think, of brilliance for so many artists, writers, actors, directors. I was doing something with the Theatre Royal Stratford East the other day, and I saw that Nadia Fall started at Tara Arts. You created an extraordinary focus for new names, new brilliance, and it continues, for which we thank you. Rukhsana Ahmad, I know I have known you for so long through Kali Theatre. Tell me, where did you get started, and what was it that galvanized you in that time?
Well, when all these guys were doing their street fighting in London, I'm afraid I was a bit far away. I was still in Pakistan, living in a rather middle-class, protected household. It was a family that didn't do politics, interestingly, because it was, I suppose, connected with the army in a sense. I think just before my marriage, the two significant things that happened were the war and the liberation of Bangladesh. Just before that liberation, I lost my brother in a hijacking incident, which was to do with that war, and which was to do with the liberation, actually, I suppose, to be exact. And I think the big thing for me was that I was terribly anti-war. And the only marches that I was committed to when I came to London were the CND marches and my family. And I came with the idea that I'm going to uproot my husband and take them all back to Pakistan before the children are any older. I had 3 children to raise in that time. The summer of '76 was a bad one because I think I was having a baby and it was really hot. And I remember going off to Brent Cross, which was just being made just to cool down. And I remember the famine, I remember the riots as they were called, but that was a moment that did politicize me, because I think we were all very sensitized to the situation as immigrants. I think I'd lost my class, I suppose, and caste privilege, if you might like to describe it like that, because I wasn't mainstream anymore in London. I was a minority. I came as a lecturer, university lecturer from Pakistan, but I had no job here, no prospect of a job, no connections. And I think that's what galvanized me into action, the sense of loss of status and the sense of change that was threatening to change things for the worse in Pakistan for women. I was very connected to politics in Pakistan, much more interested then at that time in politics in Pakistan than I was in the Labour Party and its shenanigans, or the Conservatives and their tricks. So I suppose when the Hudud ordinances were promulgated by General Zia, I decided to start writing. As you asked, what were your drivers, what was your impulse to change? One was the quest for selfhood, if you like. I needed to find where I'd gone to, the person that I was, instead of just being reduced to mum and carer. And I needed to find out what's wrong with the world. Why do women do so badly? So I started a book. I thought I would be writing a book about the status of women in Pakistan. Thankfully, that didn't get to see its culmination, but instead I produced a collection of poetry in translation, which is feminist poetry in translation, under the title of We Sinful Women, because I think I was put in touch with the women's movement in Pakistan as a course of my research, in the path of my research. And I was so impressed by the women who were working there under the horrible regime, still trying to fight, trying to discover how to recapture their ground that had been lost. And I think that was a good time in some ways for the Arts Council, because with the Arts Council resourcing, I was able to get the book together. I was at that time in touch with, in fact, I started writing art reviews, film reviews and theater reviews, and I discovered Tarats. I remember this beautiful actor here, Sudha, in Manto's, what was it, Kolo?
This story is not for telling.
This story is not for telling. I thought, wow, this is amazing. That was such a discovery. And your little clay cart I went to see. I reviewed all these things, and I think at that time Ravinder Randhawa got in touch with me. Now, she's a novelist that some of you might remember from those days, and I think some of our work is now archived here. The Asian Women Writers Workshop was a big influence on me. I think it politicized me. It strengthened my sense of who I was as an Asian, as a South Asian. Interestingly, in Pakistan, they were getting more and more monochromatic. You know, we have become, in both those countries, actually India too now, more and more kind of, we've cohered around a single religious identity, which wasn't there at that time. But there was no prospect of seeing as many Asians as there was at the workshop. The 7 or 8 women who were there, and even Meera Syal was amongst them at that time, I think.
Yeah, I think you had Tanika Gupta, you had a whole sort of plethora of extraordinary writers coming in to the Asian Women Writers Collective. I'm going to stop you there because you've referenced everybody, so I want to get round there. But it must be said, Rukhsana, also, we must at this point pay homage, because Rukhsana is also one of the co-founders of SADAA, as the leader. So you're here for many reasons, but I'm going to move to Shobana, who's next to you. Shobana, you come from a different discipline, which is dance. What was your story in the 80s?
Well, I suppose, each story is personal. So for me, I really kind of engage with Britain as someone who might, want to make choreography and do dance in the 80s. And my route was, I came with connections to Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and India. And I came here to do English literature at university. And then, because I'd always done dancing, I wanted to then, stop doing what probably my parents wanted me to do, which is to work at the university and do something in the arts. And so I think my starting point was just my collision with everything multicultural. And I think I'm still kind of reeling from the impact. Because I found that very surprising. First of all, I realized that in fact, the definition of Indian or Asian that multiculturalism afforded was just so unnuanced and one-dimensional that I actually found it quite difficult to recognize myself in it. And I realized that in fact, no matter how many performances I did as a Bharatanatyam dancer, in various town halls all over the country, there was a huge mountain to climb, no matter how much explanations and display one did. I just came to the conclusion that in fact it would be very difficult. There were certain challenges that could never be overcome. And just very simply, in Bharatanatyam, it's the flexed foot that's the acme of elegance. Now, I really wouldn't know how in English one could change the word elegance from everything that was linear, slim, uninterrupted as a kind of pointed line in a ballet dancer is, and get it to mean a foot that was on the floor and flexed and creating, a very interrupted line. And so that was a challenge because I kind of felt actually that it would be impossible to actually change the word elegance and for it to include such a different concept of what was elegant. And I think even though I'd spent years studying English literature, and I think when I came to Britain, I just assumed that I was in a kind of information order that was a bit more equitable, but I realized the opposite was the case. And there's one thing that I hadn't learned about Britain was that the impression I made was already created by hundreds of years of I suppose what Said would call Orientalism. So if there was a woman dancing, or an Asian woman per se, or Asian, I realized that there was a long journey to battle all the preconceptions that were there. And I think for me, reading Said and then reading Salman Rushdie's article, there's no such thing as Commonwealth literature, it kind of really helped me understand the way I was perceived. And therefore, just understanding that kind of made it clear what my territory could be. I remember going to the Arts Council, and at that point, there was something called ethnic arts. And obviously, the real term was the arts of the ethnic minorities. But I found it quite interesting how just being the shortened form, ethnic arts, people seem to be quite content with that conflation, And there was someone in the dance panel at the Arts Council, a very nice person, who kind of said, I really don't understand why you have problems with this term, ethnic arts, because I think it's a very pure term. And, you should be happy with this very pure term. And I didn't say this to her, but I thought, if there's one person who's pure here, it's probably you, not me. I said, thanks to empire, my family are scattered across the globe, and I speak English, I speak my language Tamil, I was living in Malaysia, so I had to learn Malay. So actually, I don't think there's there's one word that doesn't occur to me automatically to describe myself, and that is pure. So in a way, I suppose my dance making really started from trying to assert my authenticity as an impure person, if you like. And it was kind of difficult, I think, because what I sort of understood about multiculturalism is that if you're Asian, we are very happy for you to tell Asian stories. By all means, do lots of dances on Indian gods and goddesses if you like. But we reserve the right to tell stories about anything and everything. And I think that was the start of my choreographic career, if you like, because for me, it was important to claim an artistic territory where I could tell my impure stories.
That's really interesting because, of course, the fact that you would have to change the vocabulary of dance, both verbally and physically, is an interesting thought. It's not something I think many of us will have considered. So that's a really useful kind of stepping stone as we move around the table. But I'm going to take the line out of what you said about there being no place for Commonwealth literature, because I'm going to somebody who absolutely is a doyen of Commonwealth literature in the sense that he originates from a Commonwealth country, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and is, we're very glad to see you here. So few Sri Lankans, Romesh, Gunesekara. Tell us a little bit about where you come into this picture, this tapestry of activity and creativity.
Well, it's great to hear these stories, actually, because all of them resonate in some sense. And my head is slightly spinning because what I was going to say doesn't make sense, quite the sense it made earlier on when I was thinking about it. But, the long, hot summer of '76, the politics of the time, the nuances we need when we talk about these sort of block-like terms quite often. And it strikes me that, it's really important that our experience isn't defined by other people's agendas. And I think I felt that all along. And though the politics, racism, anti-racism, economics, all of these things are hugely, hugely important. And I guess when in the fiction I write, it is very much about how these things impact on individual lives. But when I think of myself and you ask me about, how did it all start? I think I would have been a writer anyway, whatever happened. I'm beginning to see that now. For a long time, I thought, how would I ever be a writer? And the reason I'm here in Britain and even here, actually, is not because of all those other things. It's because, in that wonderful year of '76, I fell in love. In the '80s, I had my 2 daughters. Those are the things that kind of brought me here, rather than where I was heading for when I was 17, I guess, is where I wanted to get to, was America. And it was a mixture of luck and accident that you end up where you are. And in my case, it was luck and accident I ended up here. I ended up in Liverpool when I first came in 1971. I kind of thought that was like the far reaches of America, because I thought it might be like California, because I read Allen Ginsberg, the great beat poet, saying the center of the universe was in Liverpool, the center of human consciousness was in Liverpool. And I went there, and it was a little dreary, actually. The Beatles had already gone. Streets were pretty empty. And Britain, I mean, I had spent my sort of teenage years in the Philippines, which is a very Americanized, and at that time, a very strange place. And I came to this country where shops closed on Sundays. There was a half-day closing
Wednesday
during the week. Even the television closed halfway through the night. And even the alternative culture, the drug culture and everything else was sort of half-baked, really, and a bit staid, I thought. So it was really, I was more amused than anything else. I certainly wasn't angry, I was amused. And maybe it's amusement that's turned to affection over time. But, drivers, I didn't want to achieve anything. I remember, I don't know, people who do I think in dance, there's a lot of discipline involved. You have to have a lot of drive. In writing, I just wanted to scribble. That's really all I wanted to do. And I remember reading, and it's a long-standing tradition. There's a wonderful image I have in my head of these Chinese poets of the Tang dynasty. And I can't remember their names, it's gone out of my head, but these little poems they write, and they used to run around the mountains, write on trees and boulders. And the poems were, loosely translated, something like this, like, I'm running around the mountains, scribbling, scribbling, scribbling. Will anybody read this? Who cares? And that I liked that. I really did. But in Liverpool, there wasn't anyone wearing flowers in their hair. I think I was the only one who ended up wearing flowers in my hair a few years later still. But I suppose, I did want to then not just scribble. I wanted to make a book. I wanted to write something that would turn into a book. And that happened, I guess, when I sort of started having to read. I did my A-levels here. And doing my A-levels, and even at university, I don't think there was a single other Asian or Black student in the Faculty of Arts, never mind the English department. But it didn't bother me, really, because at that time, what I was trying to work out was, why isn't the world that I know in my head, the world outside Britain, the world of the Philippines, the world of Sri Lanka, is just not, I just don't see it.
I find what you're saying really interesting because, of course, I come from a Sri Lankan background too, although I wasn't born there and didn't go there, in fact, till the summer of '76. But what's really interesting is you sort of describe, for want of a better way, that sort of happy empty-headedness of being Sri Lankan, which is very different to being Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi, where they're kind of filled with kind of fury and politics and meaning. It's a really it's interesting to hear you saying that, because there were no great political drivers.
Except there was one thing. I mean, and I guess that's what, in a sense, has made me the writer I am, because rather than the politics of Britain, which I could see was going on, but I was a visa student, even though it's a very complicated story. Actually, it came and I joined my mother here, but nevertheless, I was a visa, So I was temporary here for years and years and years and years, going to the wonderfully appropriately named Luna House in Croydon to get my visa.
I'm going to stop you there at getting your visa, because somebody who had got her visa in the 80s was Piali. And Piali, so you arrive in the UK, and what do you find in terms of artistic endeavour or hunger, or what is it that is galvanizing everyone?
Okay, I came here in mid-80s from a very culturally vibrant Kolkata, and from a life where I was very involved in all kinds of cultural activity, was like in the middle of it, singing, dancing, poetry, Tagore. I was absolutely in the middle of it, studying, doing my university, doing MA in history. And from that really vibrant cultural lifestyle, I came to Birmingham.
You're saying nothing.
It's being recorded.
I
love Birmingham, honestly.
We love Birmingham.
We do. I do. Now I've been here for over 35 years. So I'm half my life has been here in this city. So I've grown to love it. I've seen the city change, and I've been, part of that story. But in the 80s, it was a different storyline. It was there was no cultural vibrancy. It was very dead. Broad Street, which is now like really lively club country, would close by 6:37. Everything was closed and boarded, and by 7 the city was dead. You had nowhere to go. You sit in front of the television for a bit. If my husband was a student still, and we were in a bed sitter, and I'm thinking, why am I here? There were times when I was to look out of the window and I counted cars, red cars. I thought, okay, it was dire. For the first 2 weeks, I spent like that. I didn't know what to do. I knew nobody here, and felt like getting onto the next flight and going back. Then I took control. Then I took the reins of my own life, and I walked into the Indian Assistant High Commission's office, and I demanded a job. I just said, these are my qualifications. I don't know anybody. I come from India. You've got to help me. And he liked that. I think that he gave me a job. I became an assistant consular assistant, and I had to write passports and all that kind of stuff. But the 80s was for me, was a really developmental period because I got to understand this country. I got to know terms like ethnic minority. I did not know that existed. I got to understand what marginalization was, what racism was, because you never face any. I didn't face any of that when I was in Kolkata. I was amazed. In fact, I was loved and cherished and comfortable. And then you come into somewhere where you go into a school workshop and you go into the staff room and you don't know where to sit because the chairs are allocated. So you don't sit in the wrong chair, because sometimes if you do, you're told off. Or it's little things like that suddenly comes like, do I not belong here at all? I mean, nobody loves me, nobody wants me. So it's that feeling was really quite hard. But I think I come from quite a stoic family culture, and there was a confidence there because I knew who I was. I know what I know. I knew that I had a lot to offer, and I wasn't going to give in to people who didn't know that.
Were you already a dancer?
I was a dancer.
You were already.
Yes, I trained with the Uda Shankar India Culture Center. I toured the world. I've been all over America. I've been to Russia. I've toured in many countries. So, and Britain was not unknown because I studied in a convent school, Our Lady Queen of the Missions Convent, and we studied the history of the British Empire, and we did Bible history, and we did moral science. So I was taught by Irish nuns. So it was not an alien culture. I probably knew a lot about England, maybe in a slightly fictionalized way or in a way that we were told about the culture, about the country. And I had the language, and I think that was a distinct advantage. So I remember going into settings where they'd say, you speak good English. Yes. I mean, I learned it in school. Where did you learn? I learned it in school. Where? In India. Oh, so there were a lot of surprises like that. But it was quite hard in the first few years. It was really hard for a freelance artist going into community centers or going into schools or trying to find this place for myself. But I did get a lot of help in Birmingham. I found other artists. There was Nahid Siddiqui, there was Chitralekha Bolar, there was Gurcharan Mal, there was suddenly you were finding each other. And that gave a lot of strength because we were sharing, and those friendships still, they're still there.
You're now, of course, you set up Sampad, which is...
I set up Sampad in 1990.
Yes, which is huge in Birmingham even today. I know we come to you, doffing our caps off and wanting partnerships and whatever.
But I just feel like I'm looking at the other man who I'm a fan of. It fills me with joy that we've connected. All of us have connected in some way.
Well, and
I'm very grateful for that.
I know this is a kind of meeting of legendary companies and legends. Actually, for some reason, we're not naming any of the companies, which is quite odd. But let us just hear from Sudha Bhuchar to Marsha.
Thank you. Well, I feel like, I'm literally in the company of people who've sort of shaped my life, and I'll be reading your book instantly. So, you know, for me, what's lovely to hear actually is that we're hearing how people started, not necessarily the landmark shows and the stuff we
We'll move
normally,
to that,
you
don't
know,
worry.
yeah. I mean, for me, I came to this country as an 11-year-old in 1974. And actually, you talk of an innate confidence. I had the opposite. You know, I was completely, you know, this sort of shy kid that felt out of water because previously to that, our childhood was, you know, my father was a teacher in Tanzania. So we would go Africa, India, because every 3 years he'd get a passage home. So it was quite a turbulent childhood, changing schools, losing friends, you know, which made me quite withdrawn. And I remember coming, we went to Norfolk, you know, in King's Lynn where my uncle was there. And we were the only non-white kids. So you'd get asked, you know, you were in Africa, did you go and, you know, live in mud huts? That kind of thing. And I didn't realize at the time, you know, the term racism or ignorant, you know, it just wasn't on the radar. In Africa, I literally thought there were 3 tiers, you know, and the Europeans were superior. We called them Europeans. So if you saw a white face, they had their yacht club and you'd see them on their water skis. You know, we had our sort of modest swimming club. So then coming here, and you know, you talk about the summer of '76. So from the first year in Norfolk, we came to London, and in the summer of '76, I think I didn't leave my bedroom for the whole summer because I actually had agoraphobia. You know, so it was really like, you know, it just reminds me. So my father at the time, you know, who was alive then, and he died quite young. I remember him telling my sister, you know, you've got to get her out. You've actually got to get her out of the house. So part of that getting out of the house, you know, fast forward a few years, we went to see a Diwali function where Jetinda was performing, you know, Tara Arts. And we were just like, oh my God, there are young people like us, you know, because it was this kind of irreverent sketches, you know, in a Hindu society, Diwali thing. And Suman and me were just, oh my God, there are people like us. So Suman, much more extrovert than me, went up. And Jetinda was like, yeah, we meet, you know, every Wednesday, you've got to come. And, you know, so she dragged me along. I always used to follow her, you know. And I was just like, no, there's no way I'm going on stage. So Suman was the actor. And I was like, I'll sell tickets and I'll be in, you know, in the background. And one day Jetinda comes up to me and says, I can't remember what play it was, but the actor who was supposed to be the policewoman hasn't arrived and the show's about to go. You're going on. You know? So he hands me a notebook and says, all you have to do is ask these 3 questions, you know, you'll be all right. And I was just like, my God, you know. And of course I went on stage, asked the 3 questions, walked off the wrong way, couldn't get off stage. The whole auditorium was laughing at me. I don't know why I've ended up doing this. So that was the first time I was on stage ever. Like I'd never done a school play, anything. And meanwhile, Suman was getting through. I remember we had this director called David Sulkin, because Jetinda was like, right, we're getting professionalized. You know, we're going to get experts coming and doing workshops. And he made us do things like be a tree, be a hoover. Suman just went, I don't do hoovers, and left the room. You know, you know, somehow I survived all that.
You got your nozzle out and around you.
And that's how we, you know, but Tara it was literally a place of, well, overcoming this terrible, you know, lack of confidence, but also finding out who we were. Like, I didn't know we were in Africa because of colonialism. And then we came here, and then finding out that actually my father must have got the last chance to get his British passport. You know, so we started to piece together who we were and learning about our histories and literature. And, you know, Jetinda was doing an episode from the Mahabharata, The Broken Thigh, which is how I met Christine. And the 2 of us played these, you know, male warriors. You know, I played Duryodhan, you know, this radical
Christine
casting.
was your co-founder.
Christine Landon Smith, yeah. So from
Tamasha.
that friendship, we ended up forming Tamasha in 1989. But again, like you, there was no, you know, I tell my children to have, you know, smart objectives. I was just telling my young son, you know, imagine where you'll be at 30 and then work backwards.
Oh, God.
And, you know, he said to me, this was only this morning, he goes, Mom, I'm a wild stallion, let me roam free. I was like, no, you can't roam free, you need a plan. And of course, we never had plans, you know. I mean, I studied maths, further maths, biology, and then I was doing a degree in maths and sociology, but all our time at Tara just became bigger and bigger. We'd bunk off school, you know. My mother would be just like, oh, Jetinda Verma, where is he leading you? You know. So it was after my degree that I joined Tara. So I haven't trained, you know, Tara was our school of learning. And then we formed, Tamasha in 1989, again, with no plan other than Christine had done Mulkraj Anand's novel, Untouchable, with her students in the National School of Drama in Delhi. And then we formed that in order to do that here. You know, but I forgot, of course, I was in the little clay cart, and, you know, Shobana was a great influence on us as well. You know, we were doing Bharatnatyam, but obviously not, you know, as trained dancers. You must have thought we were such a nightmare,
very
you
good,
know.
Sudha. Honestly, really well.
I played the courtesan, you know, Vasanta Sena, when I remember having to do all that kind of.
And you see,
walking
in our
yeah.
house, you're just remembered for being the first usher in the Archers.
Yes, that's true. Yes. Well, I've had more press. I was looking at my, you know, archive press from being the first non-white person to be in the Archers, you know, than anything. But of course, I didn't play her for very long.
No.
But the lovely Suad Faris has been doing it.
Yeah, it's a rather dull role, but you've all kind of set up your stalls, and it's very interesting that you all really come from quite different backgrounds, more different than I had imagined. And yet I think a number of you were galvanized. I mean, Jetinda has talked about, you know, what made him want to sort of create something. And Rukhsana, I remember A Song for a Sanctuary, which was also a response to an event in this country. I don't know if you just want to tell us a little bit about that, just to get everybody thinking about those moments across the 80s and the 90s that may have either galvanized them into creating something or made them just want to create something different.
I think that was a huge thing for us, because it was the first time, I think, there was this horrible murder that happened in a refuge. I was telling you about the Asian Women Writers Collective earlier. It was set up as a workshop first, but we reformed ourselves into a collective. And Rahila Gupta, who's a campaigning journalist, was very big influence, I think, on everybody in terms of our politics, because she was very kind of radical and wanted everything black and white. And she took us all out on a march with South All Black Sisters. And she wrote a poem about Gurdeep, he's saying, sorry, Gurdeep, not Gurdeep, but the woman who was murdered.
Is it? Yes. It's just embarrassing, is it? We can't remember the name, but she had been murdered by her husband.
Well, I don't really like to name her, to be honest.
Yes, there was a huge outpouring.
But because it wasn't, people assumed that the play was a story of the murder, but it wasn't. It was a response to the murder. So it was a fiction, really, that I created. But then we couldn't find anybody to put that show on because it was so dark. And I think Rita Wolf used to be with Coronation Street, and she decided to drop out of that to take this play to production. And she wanted to direct it and be in it, and she managed to put it on. And because she couldn't find anybody to take it, she decided to set up Kali Theatre Company. And that was the first step for the creation of Kali. And soon I found that she wanted more plays, and I didn't have the capacity to write any plays because I was doing other commissions. And I started saying, look, let's get other women. And we found that there were no other Asian women writers at all who could do plays. So I set up the first writing workshops. In fact, you mentioned Tanika Gupta. She was from the writers' workshop, as well as Rahila Gupta, and as well as a lot of people from the workshop were invited to join. And they wrote shows that Jetinda very kindly put on again at Tarad's. All stories begin and end with Tarad's.
They do, actually. All roads lead to Tarad's.
All the actors that I know have been at Tarad's some point or another anyway. So it's very supportive. And I think I found myself running Kali because Rita then got married and moved to America. And I had to become the artistic director, and I ended up doing a lot of these training workshops over the next 8 years until we got some revenue funding. And then, of course, I felt I couldn't handle this anymore because it was just too much work. And it wasn't my work anyway, because I wasn't a director. So we found Janet Steele to run the company, and she was an excellent director for the company because she was very capable and she was very energetic and very committed. Did it for many years.
And what you're touching on actually is very important with all of you, I think, which is that creating that legacy, through your companies that mean that, presumably, I don't know, Shobana and Piali, if you still are performing all the time, but exactly, what you've done is you've created the legacy and the roots in for more people, not necessarily of South Asian heritage, but you've created those roots into the arts. And I just wonder if that was part of the thinking when you started,
Not really. I suppose when you start these things, actually, a lot of it is just, I don't know, there's never been like, at least for me, there's no like master plan. It was just a kind of a collection of small decisions. So, making a way for lots of people, that's a kind of a master plan. It might have been, in retrospect, like incrementally, but obviously, at the beginning, it's just like survival. And, whatever, at least for me, whatever I did was incredibly small. I could just see it was a very small thing. I mean, I remember when I first met Jetinda, it was at Riverside Studios. You probably don't remember, but I was just surprised because I thought I was just this me in this little place on my own. And it was just amazing that I began to talk to you at an interval in the play. And we were talking, actually, I was saying what I did, Indian classical dance. And then actually you rang me up later and you said, could you come and do a workshop for the actors? And at that point, because I was doing Bharatanatyam, I said, well, I could do something on Krishna. He said, well, can you just call him Harry? It'd be much easier. I said, no, I'm not going to call him Harry, but anyway, that's how our conversation started. And actually, in the end, I think you were far more demanding of classicism because I think we were just going in the opposite direction. Because I started with Krishna and probably just ended somewhere else. And then you were somewhere else, then ended with Krishna. So we kind of crossed over.
But, I mean, it's embarrassing, really, because in a sense, yes, there were kind of lots of incremental things. But I think possibly because of the death of that young boy and how it had hit you viscerally. I wasn't at the time in Southall. I was at York and having I finished my finals and having a great time, having wine and all that sort of stuff. But when that news broke, it hit you. And it hit you in the kind of, the power of it was that it could be you, no question of it. And I think that at the time, it was across generations that this is really not on. And perhaps because of that, I remember after the first night of the first show that we'd done, which was an adaptation of Tagore's Sacrifice, that we were kind of going over there, and I was with one of the other founders. And these two other friends, they were very clear, they were kind of beginning to be, they wanted to become lawyers. And as far as they were concerned, they're going to hang around for a couple of years and then off they go. And that was their kind of vision of the thing. And we were having that discussion, and I remember saying to him, and it's kind of embarrassing because it sounds like exactly the sort of nerdy, young, romantic thing that you would say. And I said to him, "No, man, our fate is going to be, we're going to beat our head against the wall, and the blood that will be shed, that's to nourish the others who come after us." I think back to that thing, I think, bloody hell, that's seriously embarrassing. But what it meant, what I mean by that is that it sort of gave a drive. So like when I talked to Shobana, it came after a few years of doing plays and thinking, what the hell is this? What's special about this? And what I meant by that was that, yeah, it's a play, it's a bunch of darkies doing a play. Other than that, what's special about it? Okay, there are the subject matters, but if you remove all of that, what's special about it? And it comes back to the point I was making right at the beginning, that this is a new culture. So how do we articulate it? What is the Asianness, if you like, of being Asian? And only by that could we survive beyond the sort of political whims. And so in a way, the meeting with you was to discover other ways of presenting a play, another language. You know, I still remember that wonderful thing that you said of the flex streak, the heel or the toe. Which side are you on? And that was great. And it was ennobling to realize, hang on a minute, there are other dramaturgies to look at. It is not just this kind of naturalism that has come. That is not the sum of all theater. And that for us to find our own language, which was also the time when we started to begin to actually open out to our own languages, not just English. And so I think that was the kind of critical thing of just finding different ways in which you tell your stories, but as honestly as you feel at the time, whatever your circumstances are.
Romesh, you're completely separated from this, aren't you? Because your stories are entirely from your imagination, not from your experience.
A couple of things to say. I mean, I think you're absolutely right about finding a language. To me, one of my answers to your original question would have been, I'm not an activist writer. I know there's a resurgence of that now. But to me, as a writer, the thing that I'm trying to do, and I think most writers try to do, is to somehow control the language and make it your own language. Because everything flows from that, really. And though you said, Sri Lankans, okay, the happy goes lucky. I mean, that's a sort of caricature, because actually, even in 71 when I came, it was just that I was quite naive, because in 1971 in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was then, just before it became a republic, was the bloodiest year it had had in modern times, when there was a youth uprising, Marxist, which was crushed, and thousands of people died. But of course, we didn't have internet, we didn't have rolling news, nobody knew about it, nobody really probably here knew about it, and even I didn't know much. But for my father's generation, it was a huge blow. It just shattered the world. But it took me a long time to digest that, actually, right through the 70s. And in the 80s, of course, you had in 1983 another eruption in Sri Lanka, which was horribly violent. And to me, that was the racism that I really needed to understand and work out. And anything I wrote had to stand the test of, does it mean anything in the face of a world like this? I didn't know why do these things happen? And in a way that politicized the writing I did. And I do remember, I mean, there's a very singular moment, which was, I think, the first story I ever had published, which was in the 80s, after a lot of scribbling going nowhere. But if I had a plan, and there was a plan, was to somehow get published as a book, the sorts of books that I used to read, ideally in a nice little book with a little penguin on the spine. And it eventually did happen for the first book. But the first story that ever got published was in a magazine called Stand. And I started writing it in the early 80s. I'm a very, very slow writer. And by the time I sort of got it to its finished form, 1983 had happened. And the story started before that, about somebody thinking of going back to Sri Lanka, somebody who spent, a middle-aged man trying to go back. And then this thing happens. And of course, everyone is thinking, how can anyone go back? All those sorts of things. So that story had a couple of endings. And I remember when it was, it was odd mixture of pain and happiness, because I had not just an acceptance for the story, but a discussion from the editors as to
so what's interesting there is, the longer you're here, the more you're able to look back and reflect and write. And
yeah,
find
to me, that's part of the imagination. I've always been slightly out of things. When I was growing up in Sri Lanka, I was probably dreaming of America and
yes.
England.
I was just going to make a sort of a slight segue to say it's almost the opposite of what's happening with our performers, who have started by looking back, but now are actually looking at what's happening around them. So they're no longer looking back for their stories or their performances. They're actually looking here and forwards. I don't know if that's right, Piali.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the 90s were, as I said, you know, it was the 80s for me was a learning period, because I got to really understand who I was, where I was, what am I expected to do, what am I not expected to do, you know, those kind of things. You know, it was really getting an understanding of the layout of the land, and then take control of things, saying that I'm not going to go into school and cook because someone has not turned up to do the cookery lesson, a parent, or I'm not expected to go and be the ambassador of India to know everything about India. I'm going there to do a dance workshop, respect me as a dancer. And that respect was missing, absolutely. There was no recognition, there was no appreciation for what we were bringing here, what my colleagues, my peers were bringing here in terms of cultural. That's why we call the organization Sampad, because it's a treasure. So, and we believe that what we have brought here is a cultural treasure, wealth that we want to share, but it needs to be respected. It has to be given status. So if you remember in the 90s, we did a number of small conferences and symposiums, which were entitled A Question of Status, A Question of Identity. And it was so important for us to come together and have that collective voice. And that collective voice started shifting things, because we all came together. I know, Jatin, you know, we focused on theater, we focused on crafts, we focused on performing arts, and we came together. We formed Aditi, which was the National Organization for Dance, South Asian dance. And that isolation had to break, that isolation of people working on their own and feeling very insecure. And we actually forced, I remember we walked into Arts Council dance meeting, dance panel meeting. I think there were 12 of us in nice Kanjivaram saris. It was all planned. Some dance officers knew about it. They orchestrated it. But we walked in and we demanded attention. We said, you cannot put us in the other category, or we were part of the folk in others. This is not a folk dance. And I even told, you know, Hilary Carty, who became later on director of dance, I said, please find some money and come with me to India. Indian dance is not 2 sticks and circles only. Yeah. So I said, please come, meet person. So she came with me and we went around India. She met Mallika Sarabhai, Chandralekha. These are immense personalities, you know, of dance. And I remember when we went to Chennai and when we met Chandralekha, she said, so what have you come to steal now? It was like slightly embarrassing, like. So, you know, Indian culture, Indian doyens of culture, they are not subjugated by this cultural imperialism. There's a huge confidence that there's a huge treasure that we've brought to this country. You know, people who've traveled, we've come with that. Our generation has.
Well, I think
we've come and we've given and we've shared. And now, of course, you know, we have 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation where there is a different identity and so on.
And you've actually, thank you for taking us to that point, which is, of course, that, you know, we're looking at that legacy of British South Asian 1st generation. And the reason that's important is because what you've then gone on to do is to create audiences that are much greater than the sum of the communities from which you have come. Because what you've done is almost, it's not a genre, but it's a completely compatible part of all arts offers, and all theatre and all dance and all writing. And I think that's quite important, because that was not the case in the 70s and 80s. And that's, Sudha, I don't know if you want to, as probably the newest company, do you want to kind of talk us through
definitely.
that?
I mean, I think this thing about, well, there were two things. One, the idea of the term British Asian, you know, that was very empowering to come here and to go. The reason this term means to us is because we are saying we could be Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, whatever, you know, we are all coming together, and Thara was that place. But through the work as well, you know, I would say that my work is, you know, being political with a small p. So it might not have come from a political agenda, but just the thing of, you know, playing warriors in the Mahabharata, playing Gandhi, you know, we used to go and research. And this is something that's my practice, is very much that thing of going and talking to communities about their stories, the community being part of, you know, the story, and, you know, doing works of literature. So the early plays of Tamasha, you know, adaptations of books. But then we went to India. We did a piece called Women of the Dust, you know, which was us going to the building sites in India and recording and getting the stories from women. And then there was a show called A Shaft of Sunlight, which is Abhijat Joshi. And that's a Birmingham story, actually, because he's an Indian writer who won a, you know, World Service radio competition. But it was about the marriage of a Hindu and a Muslim, and how he actually kind of, you know, predicted the whole Babri Masjid thing, because his play was about, you know, a wall in the city that people are fighting over, whether it's a mosque or and this predated. And, you know, we did that show in Birmingham, and young people here would come to me and say, how do I navigate my Hindu-Muslim relationship, you know? And I'm a Hindu married to a Muslim. And so it's no accident that a lot of this material that you chose, whether it was set in India, whether it was here, it very much spoke to growing up here, you know? And the whole thing about audiences, you know, we were, not only did, you know, this thing about what have you come to steal? I mean, if you actually were programmed somewhere, people wanted to tick the boxes, but you had to come with audiences. You had to prove not just your art, your, who are you attracting? Why are we programming you, you know? So we were audience developers, and Suman, you know, my sister's in the audience, very much grassroots, you know, going out there. If we're doing a show about the Hindu Sindhis in Bombay, we're researching in that community. And in those days, you know, a friend in the Arts Council would say something like, oh, so you're going back to the tribes, you know, so your work is tribal and it's for the tribes. And now I look at young people, it's celebrated. Oh, you're doing a thing about, you know, the Bangladeshis for this anniversary, and isn't it great? You can use Bangla. And, you know, if we used our languages, you'd have to go on Radio 4 and explain why it wasn't undecipherable, you know. So we were on the back foot, and we had to fight all that. And yet, despite that, you know, we had a mainstream presence as well.
Precisely, you have that mainstream presence, and you've built up that mainstream presence through that time. And Jetinda, I think I'll just come to you for a sort of end thought, really, because, you know, I didn't grow up within these communities. I became aware of you through Eastern Eye, which we have digitized as part of this ReUnited project. And I remember coming to film you one day. But you were the voice that I would hear on programs like Start the Week and on the Arts Hours. And you were the person who I think was really at the forefront of breaking through the fourth wall of prejudice, which was that you would just appear to explain why you were doing classic plays, setting them in India, why you were constantly challenging not just your own communities, but all those communities who felt we were different, but were starting to see that these stories had a commonality that was shared across race, across culture. And I just, you know, I'm interested to know if that was planned or if that just happened, how you got yourself there, because without question, you were a voice for that group of artists and performers.
Being a voice was not a plan, but the move into the classics was a very simple reason, which is we reached a point where I felt we weren't good enough. I thought writing was not good enough. I thought the stories were not good enough. So where do I look? Okay, look at that's what the classics are. That there's a structure here, or there's a story here, which has existed for thousands of years. And at that stage, rather like at the very beginning, the kind of absolute core was stories don't belong to anyone. I have absolute right, because I'm in the theater, because I'm a director, to do whatever story I want, for whatever, and my reasoning will come out in the way in which I produce it. So that is an absolute core belief. And that part of, for me, as I started sort of working on that, was this thing that, in a sense, I think for any artist, there's a sort of consciousness, or one needs a consciousness that you are having a dialogue with yourself, but also with the people who have been in your background, which is the other artist before you. And that dialogue is the critical one. And one can go sort of further and say, as a kind of Buddhist say, you're actually in death. The present is a death. Every play that we do is a death because someone has written it and gone, finished. We are on next. We have come on with them. So it doesn't matter whether it's 400 years old or 800 years old. That's what we're doing at that time. We're building that theater. So that became really important, that with that you can then, because stories touch anyone and stories have a certain kind of construct, that means you can touch anyone in there. And that should be your purpose. Since you've given me this platform to conclude, I would say now, and I've been feeling this for a couple of years, where I think we failed. And the kind of, when I say failure, I say it in the kind of generic sense of Asian arts, is that we did not find a way to break the dependency on the Arts Council.
Mm.
We failed because we did not get our own people to fund us. That's the big failure, and that for me is what I look to the next generation for. That really get your own to fund it, because without that, you're always at the mercy of how others describe you.
That's a very interesting end point, because in our last roundtable, which was looking at the top-down policy and the politics and whatever, what we were talking about was that even once you had found funding and you were taking work out into the community, what we seemed to be failing to do was create new audiences so that they might come in to see our work, but they're not necessarily going and seeing all work. It's not necessarily.
Yeah, but even that was put on. It was even that was put on you.
Mm.
You know, it
exactly.
isn't just as individuals.
That is the funding streams that Jatinda's talking about. Maybe there's.
I mean, I know you wanted to end here, but I have to come into this.
That's all right. Your sister does it all the time.
No, but this whole thing about, we've done Tamasha, we did so much drive. We'd have these fundraising galas, people would come, you'd raise 25K on occasion, but it's not, those funding were always, project based. Mm. And I think this thing about getting philanthropists, it will always come with an agenda,
Well,
we all have to.
Exactly. I mean, because that was the challenge for my company. Yeah. Because we were fully funded by the Arts Council. Actually, now we're not. I think we're sort of at 35%, because we actually, I mean, I'm not saying it's not from Asians. They're from all over the world, Iranian, American, but it is possible, and it does change the kind of work you make, obviously. I think it's still brilliant that there is an Arts Council, and I think in a way we'll be impoverished if we weren't funded by the Arts Council, because I think that we're part of a nation's vision of the arts. So I think that's a really important thing to have. But I don't think it's impossible to actually draw your resources from non sort of state sector players. And in some ways, I mean, a few years ago, actually, we were funded by Tata to tour India. We didn't have to fill in a single form or say how many vegetarians there were in the audience. we were looked after very well, fed very well, and we had a brilliant time. And so, you know, it can happen.
Lots of
and-
letters going off to Tata. Rukhsana.
I just wanted to say that actually it's not so much about the funding, it's about the fact that there is a real splintering. Sadly, even of the South Asian identity, the unity that we created, the friendships, deep friendships that we all have, personal ones with each other, are at risk because there is a fracturing of that that unity that was found at that time. And that began with Salman Rushdie's book and the protests with Midnight's Children. And I think it got much worse after 9/11. And this whole terrorist project that, if you like, the labeling the Muslims as terrorists meant that there was a real separation and isolation of Muslims. And the communities have really become much more mistrustful of each other. It makes it much harder for people to put on plays, which are credible plays for both communities, Muslims and Hindus, which are the majority communities, to enjoy together.
Even when they're British, about their British lives.
And that splintering is something that really does worry me, because I think that is being imported from the subcontinent, and that's a reality one cannot ignore.
Well, that's a stirring, a sad note on which to end. But on the other hand, it means that there are tasks ahead for the next generation, because having stood on the shoulders of these giants, who also stood on the shoulders of the previous giants, it's an ongoing task, isn't it? It's an ongoing task to be the representation of particular communities or particular stories or particular diasporas and ways of seeing the world. But thank you so much for this, because we were just trying to capture that period in the 80s and 90s. And what you've done is you've thrown forward to the problems that are up ahead and already showing themselves, but also shown how it is just possible to the whole point of the arts is that we keep reinventing ourselves. And so I thank you, Piali Ray, Romesh Gunesekara, Sudha Bhuchar, Jetinda Verma, Shobana Jeyasingh, and Rukhsana Ahmad. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Everyone, there's food and drink outside.